Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress, and welcome to today's webinar, Compiling a DevExtreme App, Move Away from Alert as a Debugging Option, or the shortened version, Practical Debugging for PhoneGap, presented by DevExpress CTO Julian Bucknell and DevExpress Technical Evangelist Paul Usher. In today's session, Julian and Paul discuss how you debug your app on the device and share some techniques and solutions to help you with this common scenario. This session is being recorded and it will be made available on our DevExpress YouTube channel. We will also do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Paul and Julian.
Thank you, Amanda, and good morning, everyone. And good morning, Julian.
Good morning, Paul. How's things with you?
Well, we've been hampered by technical
technical issues all morning. This is going to be a kind of miracle if you actually get through this webinar without something going wrong.
Like mice disappearing or blizzard stopping traffic.
Yes, last week was pretty hair-raising in Colorado. We had this amazing blizzard which shut down the interstate and shut down Denver International Airport. Luckily today it's pretty good, so I'm not going to get a power outage and all the rest of it. So we're good. We're good. Now,
Global warming at its best.
If only my docking station would work properly, we could be onto a good webinar here.
I'm sure that we will be blessed anyway. So today's going to be a little different because we're going to be talking about a side effect created or caused by mobile development, in particular hybrid apps using PhoneGap DevExtreme. Now, before I do get started, I want to talk just a little bit about some questions that come up about PhoneGap and Cordova. Before I jump into that, we're going to have a quick intro. We'll talk about why the problem exists and then the PhoneGap plugin ecosystem. I'm then going to step you through some GapDebug issues, and Julian's going to talk about some tips and tricks on JavaScript debugging. And at the moment, I think he's having a few microphone problems as well, so you might be muting for a second. No?
I think we're fine. I'll mute myself.
Okay. Now, quite a few people ask when we mention the word Adobe PhoneGap or Cordova if they're the same thing. So I wanted to start out by just putting some of those questions to rest. You see, PhoneGap was created around about 2009 by a company called Nitobi. In 2011, Adobe purchased that company along with the rights for the PhoneGap brand. Now, part of what had been created was this open source core, which was actually donated to the Apache Software Foundation, and it was put under the name of Cordova. So at that point, you could almost say that the two items were identical. So what does that mean some 5 years later? Well, initially there was very little difference between the two products, but Adobe had some really big plans to actually extend the functionality with their own proprietary services. And we're actually starting to see some of that these days with the functionality such as PhoneGap Build. And they want to continue to build that out. Now, Cordova itself is really just a simple set of APIs, albeit powerful. And they're used to call JavaScript functions that map native code and plugins. This effectively means that you can transfer any kind of data from native to web. Now, one thing that people don't always realize is that Cordova is capable of pretty much anything you need to do on mobile. It's got a really powerful low-level API that comes with some pre-made functions, as well as the ability to create plugins and do your own thing. So the only limitation is your ability to create a plugin if it's not there, and the actual ecosystem is growing all the time. And that's Cordova in itself. So then come along and say, well, PhoneGap really is Cordova plus all the extra things that Adobe bring to it. Now, with File New experience, you can actually just choose to use the straight Cordova APIs, Or you could choose to enter into Adobe's ecosystem and use the PhoneGap distribution of Cordova. Now, Adobe have always maintained that the ultimate goal for Cordova was to make itself obsolete, in that all the different vendors of the browsers would eventually implement the APIs so that Cordova wouldn't be required. And we're starting to see this. We've now got access to things like geolocation directly inside a browser, as well as things like the camera API. And there's a few different webinars that Julian and I have done over time that actually demonstrate some of these things. But then you'd consider, well, some 5 years down the track, not all vendors have really embraced a lot of this other functionality. So much so that really we've got camera, we've got geolocation, and I'm sure there's another couple, but it doesn't seem like a huge amount as far as implementing that into every browser. And we've also seen from our recent webinars on data within DevExtreme that there's such a disparity between different vendors and the functionality just inside some of the standards that have been implemented. So in short, Cordova is a community-powered version of PhoneGap. PhoneGap becomes Adobe's productized version with their ecosystem on top of Cordova. Cordova is both a low-level native app browser API and set of plugins, and PhoneGap, as I say, just allows you to embrace some other things and take technologies such as PhoneGap Build to make your life a little easier. So why do we end up doing a presentation on debugging a DevExtreme or PhoneGap application? Well, if you're going to write pure JavaScript, then obviously you can just jump into your browser and start debugging it normally. But the minute you then try using that ecosystem where you've got plugins that are talking at a native level to the underlying hardware, you obviously can't run that inside a local browser. This is where products such as GapDebug really come along and help as a user. So what we might do is actually jump in and have a look at a couple of examples. Now I'm going to be using the DevExtreme inside Visual Studio for this. And we'll start by taking a look at the kitchen sink demo. Now this demo is actually, all the source code is produced or released with our product, so you can find it sitting under your public documents on your machine. And of course, you can dissect it and see how we build certain things. I'm going to start running this inside Chrome. Now this particular demo uses all native JavaScript libraries, so there's nothing that I'm trying to go inside to that lower level to worry about. Obviously using the simulator experience, I can just press F12 to bring up the tools, and I'm going to see things like the console window, and obviously I can navigate to the source, drill down and see what's going on. Now Julian, in your experience, while we're sitting just inside Chrome and developer tools, talk us through some of the things that we should or shouldn't be looking for when it comes to debugging JavaScript applications.
Well, I think there are several aspects to this that I found when I'm writing JavaScript code and running it and debugging it. The first point to note is there is no compiler. And to those of us who've moved over from, say, C# or Java or whatever it may be, we are or you have become reliant on the compiler finding some classes of errors for us. Because there is no compiler, this actually points to why TypeScript is so popular instead of JavaScript, because you're going to be relying on the TypeScript transpiler, if you like. Transpiler converts TypeScript code to JavaScript to find that kind of class of error. You know, things like I'm calling this function and expecting an integer or a number for the first parameter, but I pass a string, for example. You know, that kind of class of function, TypeScript is very good at that kind of class of error. TypeScript is very good at finding that those errors. Now, personally speaking, oh, you're going to say something, Paul?
I was going to mention there's some other tools I know that you prefer when it comes to writing your JavaScript if you're not using TypeScript?
Yeah. Personally speaking, as those of you who've heard us talk on webinars about DevExtreme in the past, is that I use a linter to statically analyze my code. I use something called JSLint. It's available at jslint.com, but there are several others like JSHint and so on. And I view this as being the kind of first step or the first stop on the debugging path for JavaScript. Find certain errors just by saving your file. I've actually hooked up JSLint to Sublime Text, and as I save a file, it actually runs it through the linter and gives me warnings about my code that I can then immediately fix. And then there's the use strict statement at the top of the outermost functions in your code. This is a runtime error catcher for another set of errors, such as the invalid use of this, which has always been a problem in JavaScript, and global variables and what have you. Another habit that I've broken over the past year is the use of alert, the alert function, to show important internal values as you run your code. You've got a bug in your code, you throw in a few alerts to see what values are being passed around or being calculated and all the rest of it. Now, there are several reasons for my dropping alert, as it were. First of all, the browser gets in your way. It'll warn you after 3 or 4 of these that the JavaScript code is throwing up an inordinate number of dialog boxes. So you have to reply to that one and say, okay, please show me the dialog boxes. Second is, once the alert has been dismissed, it's gone. Whatever info the dialog was showing is, in the bit bucket essentially. So you better make sure you make a note of it somewhere. And third, that I've really found now is that alert is just not available with Node.js. And I'm starting to use, over the past year or so, I've started to use Node as a code runner a lot more than I did in the past. In the past, I'd actually write an HTML page, I'd incorporate the script file into the HTML page, and I'd be using a browser and the browser debugger. These days, I write some code, and I use Node to execute that code so I can see immediately. Again, it's hooked up to sublime.txt for me. So you should be using console.log instead.
Well, let's just imagine that for a second, Julian.
Yeah.
Yeah. Coming from a C# or a .NET background, we've all used message box to throw something up on screen. Alerts the equivalent.
Exactly.
When it comes to an actual application running, when generally talking about a mobile device, there's no console, there's no F12 developer tool when you're talking about a compiled web view. So whilst I appreciate everything you're saying about don't use alert, there's got to be that fine point between, well, how else can I debug it? I suppose that's part of what we're going to show today as well, but certainly sometimes I think maybe it's just an old habit, but alert or messagebox.show is easier than worrying about this background logging.
It is to a certain extent, and that boils down to yet another stop on the debugging train, if you like, is you're going to be writing an application that you're going to be compiling with PhoneGap on a device. There are certain parts of your application which will actually just work in a browser. So you should be debugging those sections inside your browser. It's a lot easier to debug inside your browser than hook up your device, download the app onto the device, compile the app, download the app onto the device, and hook up your debugger there. So that's another thing where console works really well for you, because the debugging tools in your browser have a console view and the ability to send messages to it and see text and browse through that text and so on and so forth. So before you even get to the device part of things, there is a certain amount of your application, I think, that you can debug inside, say, Chrome or Firefox. So don't forget the console view in that debugger, the HTML view, which is always important, and sometimes the network view as well is essential. So you're doing an AJAX call and you want to check that the request is sent out correctly. Was it a GET versus a POST? Is the URI correct and the data correct, and so on and so forth, and that you get the right response code back, such as code 200 for success. And again, this is all, you know, standard web development stuff, I'd say. And sometimes I've personally never used them in any great detail, but it's sometimes worth using a packet sniffer to view the packets that are being sent out across the wire directly between your client-side application and the server application, or the web service, or whatever it may be. Personally, as I say, I've hardly used any. I think you've used one. You keep on recommending one to me.
Well, depends on what if we're testing web services or web API, then I'm a big fan of things like Charles Debugger. I know that a lot of people use Fiddler. Tools such as Postman for checking web services and posts. So there's certainly some great tools there. But of course, some of this then becomes even more difficult when you've got 500 or 5,000 users out there with your application. They've downloaded it from the App Store, and all of a sudden you start seeing reports of a blank screen or it's just dropping out. And this is particularly prevalent when operating systems get updates that you cannot control. If you're running, say, an iPhone, Apple release an update, you can't say to your users, well, don't update to 9.3 because we haven't tested it or because there's a bug. It's outside your control. And because it's a mobile device, we're not going to have the option of doing things like a quick TeamViewer session to find out what's going on. So I think in general, debugging a mobile application is one of the most difficult aspects to set up. You can't just quickly run up a virtual machine that mimics every one of your user types. There's so much other stuff going on. And that's really what brings us to some of the things we want to look at today.
Right.
Now, I know that through our support center, when it gets to the point of how do I debug a PhoneGap application that's got these plugins loaded, the guys recommend a product called GapDebug. Now, what's really nice about GapDebug, first of all, it's free for local debugging. So we're not here to try and sell a product. We're here to simply share some of our experiences and try and make life easier for anybody that's working in this scenario. Second really cool thing about it is that there's a version for both Windows and Mac. Now, it's built on top of the Chrome tools, so you've got to have Chrome installed when you run it. But they've done a phenomenal job of integrating their tools in with devices and that whole debugging experience. Download is really quite simple. Just jump on there, Genutech Products GapDebug. I've got the URLs in the slide deck later. Download, and there's a couple of quick setup processes. Now, I'm not going to go through all the setup steps required. You can be up and running in just literally a couple of minutes, and they've got a great section on their website under Learning Center on best practices for actually setting it up, depending on whether you're using iOS or Android. So today what I want to do is just focus on how easy it is to start debugging that PhoneGap application inside or using GapDebug. Now, we've seen that we've run the kitchen sink demo inside our browser. What I want to do is actually build this as a package and deploy it to a real device. Now, for simplicity, I'm actually running a virtual machine. It's not a simulator, it's a complete virtual machine. I've chosen the Samsung Galaxy S5, and I'm using Genymotion as the virtual machine engine. I just find that out of all the ones that we've played around with, Genymotion is really quite stable and gives me access to quite a large number of different VMs directly from their site. So here we've got, on this right-hand side, the live virtual machine. We can see that, bring up the calculator, and it's running the Android operating system. So it's not some mimicked web browser. My first step.
I'd just like to point out that for a webinar on debugging native code, using a virtual machine is going to be miles easier than you just saying, well, here on my Samsung that I have in my hand, you could see if you only hear. So the virtual machine is ideal for this kind of thing. So, but debugging on an actual device is just as simple.
And using GapDebug, as we're going to see, quite literally plug your cable in, connect your device, and it detects it. And that's one of the things we want to bring out. Having said that, debugging on a virtual machine is the second step up from using your browser.
Right.
Because, you know, browser, JavaScript, nice. Virtual machine, you do get access to that underlying architecture. You can have the camera, you can have the real file the file system. So you're actually running the correct OS, you're running the correct libraries and seeing things in real time as opposed to some emulated type scenario. Now, the step here would be to take the kitchen sink demo, and using the built-in DevExtreme packaging, I want to build a native package. And there's a couple of little steps required to create your package for working with GapDebug. The first step would be come to properties and to turn on this debuggable flag. I do question the word, but it is a word, so debuggable. Now, this is how, or when the package is created, what allows GapDebug to say, hey, yes, I'm allowed to actually talk to this thing. Second thing I want to do is just set up my certificate for provisioning. And I've chosen Android at this point because it's a heck of a lot easier than setting up all my iOS provisioning. The next option I want to do is simply build native packages. Of course, here we're seeing the templating outside or from inside the DevExtreme interface, and I'm going to choose Android. All I should need to do is enter my password, which I hope I remember. Of course, if you don't yet have a certificate, we've built in the tools to make that a breeze as well. I'm going to choose build. And what we're going to see happen now, in the background, the DevExtreme templating is going to go away and create the APK file, which is what I need to sideload into the Android device itself. I've got a couple of warnings saying that I've got some images missing. It's not going to affect anything here, but my Android package was built successfully. So I'm going to browse for result and then just close this window and move that out of the way. Just, I suppose, as a really simple example of how easy GapDebug is to use, I'm going to launch it. It's not running, so we'll find it, GapDebug. It puts itself as a service into the system tray. It's just loading here, and we've got the service. I'm going to say Open Debug Tools. Now you'll notice as this comes up, it's prompting me on the left that I can connect a USB device. Looks like I opened it twice. And what you'll also see is the fact that it's detected that I've got a device connected. It knows, and I've done nothing here other than started my virtual machine. It's detected that, hey, there's a Samsung Galaxy S5 running and it's now available. For me to deploy that APK into that virtual machine, I'm simply going to drag the APK over the top of GapDebug. You'll see it goes through, does the upload and the install, and then tells me that the actual package has been installed. But we can see on the right-hand side, inside the Genymotion virtual machine, that the application's running. If I click on this here, the first thing you notice, Julian, is the fact that it just looks like Chrome Developer Tools.
Yay! Absolutely. That's familiarity does not breed contempt in this case. It just makes it easier for you to understand what's going on, how to use the product, how to start debugging, watch the network, watch the console and all the rest of it. It's all very familiar.
So as I run the application on the device, which given GoToWebinar will be a little sluggish, I could do breakpoints. I can use all the tools that I'm used to using for that pure JavaScript experience, but actually inside the debugger. One of the really cool things for Android applications, if you've got a external device connected, is you can actually turn on screencast, so you can be looking inside the GapDebug window at what you're seeing on your device screen as well. So that's quite nice. Now there's all sorts of options inside GapDebug. You can take screenshots, you can download system logs, you can toggle instant debugging, you can run side-by-side versions. As I said before, the documentation is really quite thorough when it comes to different things you can do there. But of course, this particular example isn't using any plugins. So technically we could do what we're seeing as we could with Chrome. So what I'm going to do is just terminate the app. I'm going to do it from within the virtual machine because I want to show you something else. And this applies whether you're using a USB cable or if you're using a virtual machine as we are. I'm just going to terminate that application, and you'll see straight away that GapDebug is talking to this thing in real time. Now, I've taken my DevExtreme app, I've compiled it or packaged it, had GapDebug installed it onto the device and set it running, and now it detects the fact that, hey, there's nothing else for me to be connected to. At this point, if I wanted to relaunch it, I could come in and launch it from here. If I launch it on the device, it's going to detect that that is running as well. So some really, really nice interaction between what's going on. But I want to show you an application that not only has some code issues, but uses the PhoneGap plugins. So we've got an application called Pocket IQ. It's just one that I play around with. Interestingly, there's a JS lint file because anytime I show Julian anything, the first thing he does is has me lint it. And the file I want to play with is SQL test. If I try and run this application inside the simulator, it's going to fail straight away. And that's because as a product, if I come to the properties window, it's using a number of Cordova plugins. In particular, the one that I'm really interested in is this SQLite helper. If you watch or listen to the broadcast we did a few weeks ago on data inside DevExtreme, handling data is a big deal. And one of the options that was available is the ability to use SQLite. But because it requires a plugin, you can't just jump into the browser. And we talked in depth about all the reasons or all the pros and cons for local storage and all that sort of thing. Now, I could do exactly the same process as we did before, come along and build native package, and I want to build it for Android. Because I did that just a little while ago, I can jump up to the desktop, go to my debug shortcut, and we've got the Pocket IQ APK. I'm going to do the same thing and just drag that in real time into GapDebug. We'll see that after it loads it or installs it, it's going to run it. I'll click here to see what's going on. Now you'll notice straight away that there's an error in the console. And so this is what Julian was talking about, being able to capture things really quickly or succinctly by having access to that console. And of course, I couldn't have this if it was just the experience on the device. This particular error I'm already aware of. It's due to some changes that I've been playing around with in views, and it's not what we're here to talk about. So what I want to try to start with is just press the Create Table button. And we're going to see, I'm sorry, Julian, an alert box.
What? An alert. Very good.
Not only did I have an alert box, but I've also got this error appearing in the console. So what I'm going to do is jump into our view and bring up the SQL test JS file. I'm going to get rid of our expressions window for a second. Now, what's really nice here, remember, I'm running this on a real device. We're not sitting inside a browser or a simulator. I'm going to click on Create Table, and I get my ability to step through code. You can see even on the on the executing application, it's showing that it's pausing the debugger, and I could step through and see what's going on. So at that point, even though it's on the device, I can still interrogate every aspect of the application. But this is where it starts to get really, really cool. Let's just continue and run, get rid of our OK. Remembering what Julian said, the alert boxes are could be causing problems in themselves. So because I'm here, I'll just disable the breakpoint, and I'm going to change this and say console.log. And as well as that, what I want to do is show a DevExpress UI notify. Now, before you start screaming, Julian, I know I've made a mistake, and that's for a reason.
That's what you tell me all the time, Paul.
No records for 4 seconds. Okay, watch what happens in the console window when I actually press save now. Recompilation and update succeeded. You see, even though I'm debugging, I've got the ability of actually updating the code on the device, which is wrapped inside my APK, in real time. Now, I think that's cool, really, really cool.
It is. It's like edit and continue in .NET or in Visual Studio, but even better because you're on a different device than you're actually running this debugger on.
Absolutely. So we've introduced a couple of new things. Straight away, we can see, hey, DevExpress is not defined, and that obviously is the purpose typo that I made. So now I'm going to go, phew, that was easy. That's all I had to do. Hit my create table button again, and I still have these 2 errors. It just so happens that the UI notify event doesn't take an integer there, but actually takes a 2-season success. And I can spot just down here, there's another one, and let's do error down there. Oops, just for the fun of it. Now, interestingly, on the Android, the toast notifications don't use icons, so there's not a lot, but recompilation update succeeded. I'll run create table. We can see I've got my connected message, no records, and console.log has also pushed out no records. The obvious thing here is that any changes you make in your source code here, you're going to need to take back through to your original source, be it Visual Studio, be it Sublime Text. But as far as those annoying debugging sessions where you're wanting to just go in and do one thing after another, or things that don't get picked up by JSLint, it is really important or really powerful to be able to use tools such as this to step through and make that whole experience a lot less painful. I haven't had to go back to Visual Studio. I haven't had to recompile my package and redeploy it, which frankly is one of the most mundane or annoying tasks when working with mobile, where you've got to keep deploying out to a device. So for me, the huge take-home value is just the fact that I can work in real time, iOS, Android, debug, and get through those frustrations of what's going on. Anything you want to add at that point, Julian?
No, I think you nailed it. The fact that you don't have to go back, alter your code in Visual Studio, recompile everything, type in your password again for the certificate, blah, 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 drag it over to the APK, over to your debug session, and so on and so forth. It just makes the whole debugging process a lot simpler and a lot easier and a lot more fulfilling, I would say.
I know that debugging this way is not everybody's cup of tea. The fact where you make small code changes, see the difference. But certainly if you're wanting to step through particularly complicated methods, and I know you're a big fan of having your code explain or document, I think you call it self-documenting code, that if you still need to step through certain things and see what's going on, that this is one of the best options there. Right. Now you can see it at the moment. I can run side-by-side applications. So I can switch between the kitchen sink, or I could switch between the Pocket IQ app as far as the debugging experience. And you could have multiple devices connected. So there's just so much sitting there that you can play with inside this tool. Now, Julian, I wanted to also give you the opportunity, while we're talking debugging in JavaScript, just to share some of the war stories or things, maybe the gotchas that you come across in your JavaScript day-to-day stuff.
It's kind of hard, really, but in essence, the thing about JavaScript and client side, and here we have PhoneGap and native applications running on different platforms, is the variety of platforms that are going to be executing about client-side web apps, for example. The browsers are all different. Yes, they're getting very similar in the features they support, but only just yesterday I was playing around with trying to understand touch events versus mouse events, for example. Here I am, looking at my XPS 13. It's got a lovely touch screen, and it's an ultrabook, essentially, very, very light ultrabook. And so I thought, yeah, let's see what happens if you write some code and you want to not only trap a mouse event, but also a touch event, for example. So what happens first? Is it the touch event that gets fired first, or is it the mouse event that gets fired first, or does the touch event get converted into a mouse event? And all of those kind of questions. I wanted to do a little bit of debugging, a little bit of playing around to see, what I could discover. And the very first thing I discovered is I use Firefox, and Firefox has disabled touch for devices which have a mouse and a touchscreen. And so I wasn't getting any touch events at all. So you kind of think these days, 2016, our browsers are pretty much all equal, but they're not. So in my investigations yesterday, I just basically switched to Chrome, which does allow for touch and mouse events. And you can see the difference and see what's being passed around and all that kind of stuff.
So one quick question there then, Julian. How would you, or how did you determine that Firefox wasn't receiving those events? Like, what was the process, and was that something that took a while? Was it?
Oh, it's quick Googles, and you find out pretty quickly that Firefox doesn't do what you're expecting it to do. So I just switched to Chrome to try out exactly the same. In fact, this was an HTML page, since I was tracking something within the UI, so I couldn't use Node. And lo and behold, Chrome worked in roughly the way I was expecting it to work. And so, a bit more digging, find out that Firefox does or has turned off touch events inside a desktop browser. So Firefox on mobile is fine, but a desktop browser, which has both a mouse and a touch screen, basically the touch part of it is disabled. And the weird thing is, what with, what was it, the iPad Pro 9-inch that was announced last week, that has a, oh no, not the iPad, no, certain Android tablets do have the ability to have a mouse. So, you have a mobile device that does have a mouse and does have a touch screen, and so on and so forth. The thing I was trying to research yesterday was, how do I tell that somebody has touched the screen versus clicked with a mouse when both events are fired, essentially? And it's an interesting thing. Anyway, that's by the by. So war stories, yes. Be aware your browser is different. Be aware your debugging tools are different. Try and write your code in what I was talking about last week in my functional JavaScript session was make your code as self-documenting as possible, writing functions which are as small as possible and well named as possible, essentially.
Which I think is just good practice for any language that you use, is small, manageable methods, good names, and the argument is you shouldn't need code documentation at that point. So one question that came up is, what about test-driven development for JavaScript? Is that something you subscribe to, or?
It's interesting. I got into test-driven development a while back in C#. So you're basically trying to design some kind of class structure for your application or for a certain part of your application. So you're trying to design these classes, and through TDD, you're doing you're writing your test, you're saying this has to do that, this has to do that. And via doing TDD, you're actually creating your class structure as you go along. You recognize that such and such can be refactored, and it's going to create this other set of classes or interfaces or whatever it happens to be. And but the thing about JavaScript is it's not necessarily a class-based system at all. It's more a functional system. In fact, in the vast majority of browsers we use now, there is no class system at all. Yes, JavaScript does have prototypal inheritance, but not class inheritance. So you're tending to write functions an awful lot, and TDD and functions, I don't know. I think without having overt test scripts, I do tend to write in a TDD style. So I'm writing some code. Does it work? Yes, it does. Oh, I just noticed I can refactor this because I'm basically duplicating this bit of code. So let's, refactor that now and just run the test immediately. There's no compilation involved. You're just basically saving, running, altering, refactoring, and all that kind of stuff. So it's there to a certain extent, I would say.
Excellent. And you don't often use packet sniff, as you were saying?
No, not me. No. It tends to be that stuff I get from web services or from websites tend to be very simple. So there's no big worry about what I'm getting and whether it's properly formatted and all the rest of it. It's generally very easy to spot when it's not properly formatted. So it was like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I was altering some C# code. There was an Ajax call. I wasn't using the proper JSON serializer because I like to live on the edge. So my C# code was creating this JSON file and sending it back, and I'd misformed the JSON, because I wasn't using the proper serializer. And but at that point, it's really easy on the client side in a debugger to say, what the heck is going on? This is what I'm getting back from my call. It's in the wrong format, or I better go change my C# code. And like 3 minutes later, after all the compilation and the build steps go through, you can test that your assumption was right. So personally speaking, I've never really used packet sniffers. My data tends not to be that difficult to interpret, shall we say.
Excellent. All right, let's step through some of the URLs for being able to do some of this stuff. Now, obviously, DevExtreme, we find that being able to create packaging for the 3 major app stores available at js.devexpress.com and the mobile version at Mobile Development. JSLint was the one that Julian mentioned a little earlier. Of course, there's other tools out there, but JSLint. Now, on one of my setups, I've got a plugin for Visual Studio, which I find really useful to do the linting as well. Although Julian these days tends to stay more within things like Sublime Text.
Yes, it's Sublime is a lot faster at loading when you started from scratch. Visual Studio it's a lot better than it used to be, but it still takes a long time to start up and be ready for you to start work, shall we say.
Here's the gauntlet for you, Julian. Try VS Code.
That one of my friends on the Microsoft side actually said that to me the other day. He says, "You're talking about Sublime Text, so have you tried VS Code?" And to be honest, I tried it 6 months ago, whatever it was, and I really need to go back and play around with it a little bit more.
It's certainly, and being cross-platform, I love playing around with VS Code on the Mac, so running OS 10. GapDebug is available at Genutech Products GapDebug, and of course Genymotion for the virtual machine. Now it's always interesting when we sit down and start planning some of these webinars, and we sort of thought, GapDebug would be really cool to show people things, but how simple it is to bring it all together, to sideload the APK and then have that debugging experience. So I'm not sure if there's been any particular questions that have come up while we've been presenting. I
haven't been looking, so because basically I've been listening to you, dear chap. We don't have any questions at the moment. So.
Interjecting. Now, I know that from a DevExtreme mobile point of view, we've done quite a few webinars over the last couple of months on it, but coming up over the next few weeks, we're moving into business intelligence and reporting. So that's going to be quite an interesting thing. I think Amanda's going to be having our web pages updated to reflect that. Amanda, are you still there?
Of course. Where else would I be? Yeah, the website should be updated accordingly shortly.
And so we've got end user report designer coming up. I know that the other guys, being Mehul and Don, our fearless web gurus, are going to be doing some on the web designer for reporting as well. So over the next month or so, there's going to be a lot more information coming out from that side of it. So thank you everyone for joining us this morning. And Amanda, any other announcements?
No, just, everybody check out devexpress.com/webinars for all upcoming webinars. Like we mentioned, it will be updated with all these future webinars coming up. The next one is April 19th, your next webinar, Paul and Julian, on building and deploying the end user report designer, same time, 10 a.m. Pacific Standard. And like I mentioned previously, today's webinar will also be available on our DevExpress YouTube channel. I posted that link in the chat box. You can watch previously recorded webinars and thousands of product tutorials.
Hey, Julian, what's really cool about the next webinar?
I don't know. Oh, we're actually going to be in the same room at the same time, in the same office, in the same country. What else can I say? We're going to be sitting next to each other, essentially.
Weird.
So does that mean we can change the time of it to like 3 a.m. so I'll feel at home?
Oh, yeah, not.
Wow.
No way.
No way. I'm with Julian on that one.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody.
All right, that is it for this one. Thank you, Julian and Paul. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.